backstage area smelled like old wood and nervous energy. Margaret Chen pressed her back against the cold brick wall, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of the audience settling into their seats on the other side of that heavy velvet curtain. At 63 years old, she never imagined she'd be here. Not at Carnegie Hall. Not on a Saturday evening in front of hundreds of people who had paid good money to watch talented musicians perform. She looked down at her violin case, its brown leather cracked and faded from decades of storage in a closet. The brass latches were tarnished. One of them didn't even close properly anymore, so she'd wrapped a rubber band around it. A young woman in an elegant black dress swept past her, heading toward the stage entrance. The woman's violin case looked like it cost more than Margaret's car. Everything about her screamed professional, from her perfectly styled hair to her confident stride. She didn't even glance at Margaret. Margaret looked down at her own outfit and felt her stomach tighten. The dress had seemed fine when she'd found it at the thrift store last week. Navy blue with small white flowers, simple, clean. But now, under these bright backstage lights, she could see a small stain near the hem that she'd somehow missed. The fabric bunched awkwardly at her waist because she'd lost weight recently and hadn't had time to get it altered. Her shoes were scuffed black flats, comfortable but worn. She caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror hanging on the opposite wall. Her hair, more gray than black now, was pulled back in a bun that had already started to come loose. A few wild strands stuck out at odd angles. She'd tried to tame them with hairspray, but Texas humidity always won that battle. Her face showed every one of her 63 years. Deep lines around her eyes, spots on her cheeks that hadn't been there a decade ago. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a performer about to take the stage at one of the world's most famous concert halls. Margaret Chen, a young man with a clipboard, appeared beside her. He was wearing a headset and looked harried. "You're up next." 3 minutes, her throat went dry. "Okay, thank you." He glanced at her outfit, then at her beat-up violin case, and she saw something flicker across his face. Doubt maybe, or pity. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it and walked away. 3 minutes. 180 seconds until she either fulfilled a dream or made a complete fool of herself in front of strangers. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. She'd won her spot here through a community talent competition back in Houston. It was one of those feel-good local programs meant to give ordinary people a chance to perform. The judges had been kind, enthusiastic even. They'd told her she had something special. But that had been in a high school auditorium in front of maybe 50 people, most of them friends and family of the other contestants. This was different. This was real. The young man with the clipboard reappeared. 1 minute. Come with me, please." Margaret picked up her violin case with trembling fingers and followed him down a narrow hallway. Her shoes made soft padding sounds on the concrete floor. She could hear the current performer finishing their piece, the notes floating through the walls. They were good, really good. The kind of technical perfection that comes from years of intensive training and practice. They reached the stage entrance. Through a gap in the curtain, Margaret could see rows and rows of seats stretching back into shadows. The audience was massive. Every seat seemed to be filled. The stage lights were so bright they almost hurt to look at. "Wait here," the clipboard man whispered. "When the applause dies down and the announcer calls your name, walk straight to center stage. The music stand is already set up." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. The current performer finished with a flourish. The audience erupted in applause. It went on and on. Margaret felt her courage crumbling. How could she follow that? What had she been thinking? The applause finally faded. An announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Thank you, Kevin Park, for that stunning rendition of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto. Our next performer comes to us from Houston, Texas. Please welcome Margaret Chen." This was it. No turning back now. Margaret stepped through the curtain and into the blinding lights. For a moment, she couldn't see anything except white brightness. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw them. Hundreds of faces looking up at her. The audience stretched back so far she couldn't see the last row. She started walking toward center stage. Her legs felt like they might give out with each step. The stage was bigger than she'd expected. It seemed to take forever to reach the middle. That's when she heard it. A giggle. Soft at first, coming from somewhere in the middle section, then another from the balcony. then whispers spreading through the audience like ripples on water. She knew what they were seeing. An elderly woman in an ill-fitting thrift store dress walking awkwardly across the stage, clutching a beat-up violin case. She looked nothing like the polished performers they were used to seeing. She looked like someone who had wandered in off the street by mistake. More giggles now. Not mean-spirited exactly, but not kind either. The kind of laughter that comes from surprise and confusion. Someone in the back row said something. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Skeptical. Amused. Margaret's cheeks burned. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the violin case as she set it down on the chair beside the music stand. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, judging her clothes, her age, her appearance. Everything about her screamed amateur. Everything about her said she didn't belong here. For a split second, she considered just walking off. She could pretend to be sick, say she'd made a mistake. The giggles were getting louder. She heard someone mutter, "Is this some kind of joke?" But then something shifted inside her. She thought about why she was really here. This wasn't about impressing these people. This wasn't about proving to strangers that she belonged on their stage. This was about a 12-year-old girl who had given up her dreams to take care of her family. This was about 40 years of wondering what might have been. This was about a promise she'd made to herself when she'd opened that closet and found her old violin 6 months ago. Margaret straightened her spine. She opened the case and lifted out her violin. The wood was still beautiful despite its age, the varnish worn smooth from years of playing before she'd put it away. She raised it to her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of it against her collarbone. The giggles continued. The whispers grew louder. But Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her shaking hand steadied. Just a little. Just enough. She placed her bow on the strings and prepared to play. Standing on that stage with her violin raised, Margaret's mind drifted back to another stage, another lifetime. She was 12 years old again, small for her age, with 2 long braids hanging down her back. Her music teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was adjusting the height of her music stand in the elementary school auditorium. "You're going to be amazing," Mrs. Rodriguez had whispered that day. "I've taught music for 30 years, and I've never heard anyone play like you do. You have a gift, Margaret. A real gift." That had been in San Antonio, in a tiny apartment above a laundromat where Margaret lived with her parents and 4 younger siblings. The apartment always smelled like fabric softener and whatever her mother was cooking for dinner. There were 7 of them crammed into 2 bedrooms, but somehow it had always felt like home. Her father worked construction. Her mother cleaned houses. Neither of them had gone past 8th grade, but they both believed in education with a fierce determination. When Mrs. Rodriguez told them Margaret had talent, they'd saved every penny they could spare for private lessons. Margaret practiced in the bathroom because it was the only place she could close a door and have some quiet. Her brother Tommy used to bang on the door, yelling that he needed to pee. Her little sisters would giggle outside, trying to harmonize with whatever she was playing, but she didn't mind. The violin made everything else disappear. By the time she was 12, she'd won every local competition. Mrs. Rodriguez started driving her to regional contests on weekends, paying for gas out of her own pocket. Margaret came home with trophy after trophy. Her parents lined them up on top of the refrigerator because there wasn't space anywhere else. Then came the letter. Margaret remembered the day it arrived like it was yesterday. A thick cream-colored envelope addressed to her in elegant script. Her hands had shaken as she opened it. Inside was an acceptance letter to the Juilliard School's pre-college program in New York City. Full scholarship, room and board included. They wanted her to start in 2 months. She'd screamed so loud that her mother came running from the kitchen thinking something was wrong. When Margaret showed her the letter, her mother cried. Real tears streaming down her face. She grabbed Margaret and held her tight, rocking back and forth saying, mihija, over and over. Her father came home from work that evening covered in drywall dust. When he heard the news, he didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter, running his rough, calloused finger over the embossed school seal. Finally, he looked up at Margaret with eyes full of something she'd never seen before. Pride, yes, but also sadness, like he knew she was already slipping away from them. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind. Mrs. Rodriguez helped her prepare audition pieces. Her mother started collecting boxes to pack her clothes. Her siblings were excited and scared at the same time. Tommy kept asking if New York had tacos. Her youngest sister, Rita, who was only 5, cried every night because she didn't want Margaret to leave. Margaret tried to memorize everything about home. The sound of the laundromat machines humming through the floor. The way her father's work boots sounded on the stairs when he came home. Her mother singing while she cooked. Her siblings fighting over the bathroom. She wanted to remember it all. Then, 2 weeks before she was supposed to leave, everything changed. It happened on a Thursday. Her father was at a construction site working on a high-rise downtown. The foreman called at 3:30 in the afternoon. Margaret had just gotten home from school. She was in the bathroom practicing a difficult passage from a Vivaldi concerto when she heard her mother scream. The phone fell to the floor. Her mother collapsed against the wall, sobbing words that Margaret couldn't understand. Stroke. Hospital. Critical condition. The next few days were a blur. Her father lay in a hospital bed, the left side of his face drooping, unable to speak or move his left arm and leg. The doctors used words like brain damage and partial paralysis and long recovery. They said he'd need months of physical therapy, maybe years. He wouldn't be able to work for a long time, maybe never again. Margaret sat beside his hospital bed, holding his good hand. He looked so small in that bed, so weak, this man who had always seemed so strong, who carried 50-pound bags of cement on his shoulders, who could work 12-hour days in the Texas heat without complaining. Now he couldn't even lift a spoon to his mouth. He tried to say something to her. His words came out slurred and wrong, but she understood. "Go," he was trying to say. "New York, go." But Margaret looked at her mother's exhausted face and knew she couldn't. Her mother was 36 years old with 5 children and a husband who needed constant care. She cleaned houses for $8 an hour. There was no health insurance. The medical bills were already piling up. Her siblings were 12, 10, 8, and 5. Who would take care of them while their mother worked? Who would help their father with physical therapy? Who would make sure Tommy did his homework and Rita brushed her teeth? Margaret called Mrs. Rodriguez that night from the hospital payphone. Her teacher cried harder than Margaret did. "Maybe you can defer for a year," Mrs. Rodriguez kept saying. "Maybe they'll hold your spot. Let me call them. Let me try." But Margaret knew a year wouldn't be enough. She knew how these things went. Her father's recovery would take time. Her family needed her now. Not in a year. Now. She wrote a letter to Juilliard the next day. Her hands shook so badly she had to rewrite it 3 times. She thanked them for the opportunity. She explained about her father. She said she couldn't come. She didn't tell them she was 12 years old, and this was breaking her heart into pieces she didn't know how to put back together. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to argue with her. "Margaret, you're 12. This isn't your responsibility. Your parents will figure something out. You can't give this up." But Margaret had already decided. She was the oldest. She was the one who could help. Her father had worked himself sick to give them a better life. Her mother had cleaned other people's houses so Margaret could have violin lessons. Now it was her turn to give back. She got a work permit and started helping at a neighborhood restaurant after school, washing dishes at first, then waiting tables when she got older. Every penny went to her family. Her mother took on extra houses to clean. They learned to get by on less. The violin went into the closet. At first, Margaret told herself it was temporary. Just until her father got better. Just until they caught up on bills. But months turned into years. Her father recovered enough to walk with a cane, but he never worked construction again. He got a job as a night security guard, sitting down most of the time, making barely half what he used to earn. Margaret kept working. She graduated high school while juggling 2 jobs. Her siblings grew up. She made sure each one of them finished school. Tommy went to community college. The others followed. She was so proud of them. But sometimes late at night she'd think about that letter from Juilliard. She'd wonder what might have been. She'd dream about stages and concert halls and the life she'd given up. 40 years passed like that, just disappeared. One day she looked in the mirror and saw a 63-year-old woman staring back at her. Where had the time gone? Margaret opened her eyes and looked out at the sea of faces before her. The giggles had quieted a bit, but she could still hear whispers rippling through the crowd. Someone coughed. A phone buzzed somewhere in the back. The skepticism was thick enough to touch. She adjusted her grip on the bow. Her fingers remembered exactly where to place themselves even after all these years. Some things the body never forgets. She took one more breath, deeper this time. filling her lungs completely. Then she began to play. The first note cut through the silence like a knife through butter. Clear. Pure. A single perfect sound that seemed to hang in the air, demanding attention. It wasn't tentative or shaky. It was confident, certain, like the note had been waiting 40 years to be released and now it was finally free. The whispers stopped immediately. Margaret drew the bow across the strings again, and another note emerged, then another. She had chosen a piece she'd learned when she was 11 years old before everything changed. Before the letter from Juilliard, before her father's stroke, before life got in the way of dreams. It was a melody about longing, about wanting something you can't have, about looking back at paths not taken. The composer had written it after losing his own daughter, trying to capture the feeling of loving something that's gone forever. Margaret had always felt like this piece understood her in a way nothing else did. Her fingers moved across the fingerboard, finding positions she hadn't touched in decades. There were moments when she had to think about where to place them, when the muscle memory wasn't quite automatic anymore. Her vibrato wasn't as smooth as it used to be. Her shifts between positions weren't always perfectly clean. These were the technical imperfections that come with age and 40 years away from serious practice. But none of that mattered. Because what came out of that violin wasn't just music. It was everything she'd kept buried inside her for 4 decades. Every sacrifice. Every missed opportunity. Every night she'd lain awake wondering what if. Every time she'd walked past a concert hall and felt her heart break a little. Every moment she'd pushed down her own dreams to make sure everyone else got theirs. It all poured out through those strings. In the audience, a young woman in the 3rd row had been scrolling through her phone when Margaret first walked out. She'd giggled along with everyone else, already forming the text she was going to send her friend about the weird old lady on stage. But when that first note rang out, something made her look up. Now her phone sat forgotten in her lap. Tears were running down her cheeks and she didn't even know why. The music was reaching into some part of her she didn't know existed and pulling something out. Something about her own mother, who had given up her art career to raise 3 kids. Something about dreams deferred. Something about love that requires sacrifice. An elderly man named George sat with his wife in the orchestra section. He'd been a painter once, really talented, won awards in college. But his father had needed someone to take over the family hardware store, and George was the oldest son. He'd said yes because that's what you did back then. He hadn't picked up a paintbrush in 35 years. As Margaret played, George felt his wife's hand slip into his. She squeezed it gently, and when he looked over, she was crying too. She knew. She'd always known what he'd given up. They'd never really talked about it, but she knew. A teenage boy named David sat in the balcony with his parents. He'd been the one who'd made that comment about it being a joke when Margaret first appeared. He was 17, cocky, studying violin at a prestigious music academy. He'd been playing since he was 4. His technique was flawless. He'd won competitions. He thought he knew everything about music, but as he listened to this old woman play, his mouth fell slightly open. Because there was something in her playing that all his technical perfection couldn't touch. It wasn't about hitting every note exactly right. It wasn't about perfect intonation or flawless bow distribution. It was about truth. Raw, honest, unfiltered truth. His teacher was always telling him he needed to play with more emotion, more feeling. The notes are perfect, his teacher would say, but where's your heart? David had never really understood what that meant. He'd thought it was just some old-fashioned idea that didn't matter in modern classical music. Now he understood. Margaret moved into a faster section of the piece. Her fingers stumbled slightly on a particularly quick passage. In a competition, the judges would have marked her down for it. But somehow it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt human, real, like watching someone climb a mountain and seeing them struggle on the hard parts but keep going anyway. The melody shifted again, becoming softer, more delicate. This was the part the composer had written thinking about his daughter's childhood, about precious moments that seemed so ordinary at the time, but became priceless in memory. Margaret thought about her siblings as she played this section, about braiding Rita's hair before school, about helping Tommy with his math homework at the kitchen table, about all 4 of them gathered around their father's hospital bed, telling him about their day, trying to make him smile. She'd given up Juilliard, yes. She'd given up her dreams of being a professional violinist. But she'd gotten something else instead. She'd gotten to see her siblings grow up. She'd gotten to be there for the moments that mattered. Tommy's high school graduation. Rita's wedding. Her brother James's first day of college. Her sister Patricia landing her first real job. Would she have traded those moments for a career in music? The old Margaret, the bitter one who'd spent years feeling cheated by life, might have said yes in her darkest moments. But standing on this stage playing this music, she wasn't sure anymore. The piece moved toward its conclusion. This was the hardest part, technically speaking. A series of double stops, 2 notes played simultaneously, climbing up the fingerboard. Margaret's fingers weren't as flexible as they used to be. The arthritis in her left hand made it harder to stretch. She could feel the strain, but she pushed through. Not perfectly. Not with the ease of a 20-year-old virtuoso, but with determination, with grit. With the same stubborn persistence that had gotten her through 40 years of putting everyone else first. The music swelled. Louder now. More passionate. This was the composer's way of saying that even though his daughter was gone, even though he'd never see her again, the love remained. The memories remained. Nothing could take that away. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her own eyes, but she couldn't stop to wipe them. She just kept playing. Kept pouring everything she had into these final measures. Every regret, every joy, every moment of doubt, every moment of peace, all of it flowing through her fingers, through the bow, through the strings, out into the air where it could finally be heard. The melody softened again, growing quieter and quieter like a voice fading into the distance. This was it, the end. Just a few more notes. Margaret played them as gently as she could. The final note was meant to be held for a long time, gradually diminishing until it disappeared completely. She held it, feeling the vibration of the string against her fingers, listening as the sound grew softer and finally faded into nothing. Then silence. Complete and total silence. Margaret lowered her violin and bow. Her arms ached. Her fingers throbbed. Her back hurt from standing so straight for so long. But none of that mattered. She opened her eyes and looked out at the audience. No one was moving. No one was making a sound. They just sat there, hundreds of people, completely still. For a moment, Margaret worried that she'd somehow offended them. That maybe she'd been wrong to come here. That maybe she really was just a foolish old woman who didn't belong on this stage. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. It felt like an eternity. The silence was deafening. Margaret stood frozen on stage, her violin still resting against her shoulder, bow hanging loose in her right hand. She could feel sweat on her back, could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Had she done something wrong? Had the performance been that bad? Then, like a dam breaking, it happened. One person stood up, then another, then 5 more, then an entire section. Within seconds, the whole audience was on their feet. The applause started as a rumble and grew into a roar. It wasn't polite classical music applause, the kind where people clap gently and stop after a respectable amount of time. This was different. This was wild, unrestrained. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering, shouting. Some were crying. Margaret just stood there, completely overwhelmed. She didn't know what to do with her hands. She'd never experienced anything like this. Even in her childhood competitions, the applause had been nice but measured. This felt like the audience was trying to pour all their emotions out through their hands. The young woman in the 3rd row, the one who'd been on her phone earlier, was clapping so hard her palms hurt. She couldn't stop crying. The tears just kept coming, streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She didn't care. Something about that music had cracked something open inside her. Her name was Jennifer, and she worked at a corporate law firm in Manhattan. 70 hours a week, sometimes more. Her mother had wanted to be a painter, really talented, but had given it all up to raise Jennifer and her 2 brothers after their father left. Jennifer had never really thought about what that sacrifice meant. She'd just taken it for granted that her mother would always be there, always putting them first, always making everything work. Now, watching this elderly woman on stage who had clearly sacrificed her own dreams for something else, Jennifer finally understood. She pulled out her phone, not to scroll through social media this time, but to text her mother. "I love you, Mom. Thank you for everything you gave up for us. I see you now." The elderly man, George, was clapping with tears running down his weathered cheeks. His wife, Helen, was holding onto his arm, her head resting against his shoulder. They'd been married 42 years. She'd always known about his painting, about what he'd given up to take over his father's hardware store. She'd see him sometimes late at night, sitting at the kitchen table, his fingers unconsciously making the motions of holding a paintbrush, moving across an invisible canvas. "You should start painting again," Helen whispered into his ear, barely audible over the applause. "It's not too late." George looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. "You think so?" "I know so," she said, squeezing his hand. "I'll clean out the garage this weekend. You can set up a studio there." The teenage boy, David, wasn't clapping at first. He was just standing there, staring at Margaret with his mouth slightly open. His whole understanding of music had just shifted. All those years of perfect practice, of playing every note exactly right, of winning competitions based on technical precision. And this woman, with her imperfect technique and her old violin, had just played something that touched people more deeply than anything he'd ever managed. His mother nudged him. "Are you okay, honey?" David nodded slowly. "I think I finally get it," he said quietly. "What Mr. Kowalski has been trying to teach me. About playing with your heart." A music critic named Robert Chen sat in the press section, his notepad forgotten in his lap. He'd been reviewing classical performances for the New York Times for 23 years. He'd heard some of the greatest violinists in the world. He'd sat through countless perfect performances that left him cold. Technically flawless concerts that he'd forgotten by the next morning. But this was something different. This was why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place, back when he was a kid listening to his grandmother play piano in her tiny apartment in Chinatown. It wasn't about perfection. It was about truth, about human connection, about sharing something real. He picked up his notepad and started writing. This review would be different from anything he'd written before. He wasn't going to talk about technique or intonation or bow control. He was going to write about what really mattered. The applause continued. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. People were still standing, still clapping. Some were whistling. Someone in the balcony shouted, "Bravo!" Others picked it up. "Bravo, bravo!" Margaret finally lowered her violin and bow. She tried to bow to the audience, the way she'd seen professional musicians do, but her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her instrument. She fumbled it, caught it, felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. But the audience didn't seem to care. If anything, they clapped harder. She looked out at all those faces and saw something she never expected. Respect, admiration, connection. These people who had giggled at her just 15 minutes ago were looking at her like she'd given them something precious. A woman in her 40s, sitting near the front, was thinking about the violin lessons she'd quit when she was 14. She'd loved playing, but her friends had made fun of her for being an orchestra instead of cheerleading. So she'd quit. She hadn't touched a violin in 30 years. Suddenly, watching Margaret, she wondered if it was really too late to start again. A middle-aged man named Paul was thinking about his poetry. He used to write all the time in college. He'd even had a few poems published in small literary magazines. But then real life happened. Job, marriage, mortgage, kids. The poetry got pushed aside. He couldn't remember the last time he'd written anything that wasn't a work email. Maybe tonight, when he got home, he'd sit down and try to write something, just to see if he still could. A young mother named Lisa was holding her sleeping baby. Against her shoulder, she'd been an architect before the baby came. She'd loved designing buildings, creating spaces that made people feel something. But daycare costs were astronomical, and she'd decided to stay home. She told herself it was temporary, but months had turned into years and her architecture software was gathering dust on her laptop. Watching Margaret, she realized something. She could pick it up again. Not now, maybe, but someday. It wasn't gone forever just because she'd set it aside. The applause finally started to fade after nearly 10 minutes. People were sitting back down, still buzzing with energy, turning to their neighbors to share their reactions. Margaret stood on stage, not quite sure what to do next. Was she supposed to play something else? Was she supposed to leave? The announcer's voice came over the speakers again, warm and slightly choked up. "Margaret Chen, everyone. What a remarkable performance." Fresh applause erupted. Margaret bowed again, more successfully this time. She bent down to put her violin back in its case, her fingers trembling as she loosened the bow and tucked it into its spot. She closed the case and straightened up, turning to leave the stage. But as she walked toward the wings, something caught her eye. The young woman, Jennifer, was standing at the edge of the stage area. She wasn't the only one. Several people had gotten up from their seats and were moving toward the front. They wanted to meet her, to talk to her, to thank her. Margaret had never experienced anything like this. After her childhood competitions, maybe a teacher or two would come up to congratulate her. But this was different. These were complete strangers who felt like her music had spoken to something deep inside them. A stage manager tried to create some order, guiding Margaret to a small area near the stage door, where people could come up one or two at a time. Jennifer was first in line. Her mascara was smudged from crying, but she didn't seem to care. "I just wanted to say thank you," Jennifer said, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother gave up her art career to raise us, and I never really appreciated what that meant until tonight. Your music made me understand." Margaret didn't know what to say. She just reached out and squeezed Jennifer's hand. "Tell her," Margaret said quietly. "Tell her you see what she did. It matters more than you know." George and Helen came next. George had that look on his face, the one people get when they're trying not to cry in public. "I was a painter once," he managed to say. "A long time ago. But watching you tonight, it made me realize maybe it's not too late." "It's not," Margaret said firmly. "I promise you it's not too late." David, the teenager, approached nervously. "I study violin at Berkeley," he said. "I've been playing since I was 4. But tonight you taught me something I should have learned years ago." "Thank you." More people came, one after another, each with their own story, their own dream they'd set aside, their own sacrifice they'd made. Margaret listened to every single one, her heart growing fuller with each conversation. She'd come here thinking she was finally doing something for herself, finally claiming a piece of her own dream. But standing there listening to these strangers share their hearts with her, she realized something profound. Her sacrifice hadn't been wasted. All those years of putting others first had taught her something that couldn't be learned any other way. She'd learned what really mattered, and somehow that understanding had come through in her music in a way that technical perfection never could. Margaret finally made it backstage an hour after her performance ended. Her feet ached from standing so long. Her right shoulder throbbed from holding the violin. But she felt more alive than she had in 40 years. A staff member handed her a bottle of water, and she drank it gratefully, her hands still trembling slightly. "Ma'am, there are still people asking for you out front," the young man with the clipboard said. He was looking at her completely differently now. The doubt and pity from before had been replaced with genuine respect. "We've never seen anything like this. Usually people clear out pretty quickly after a performance, but they don't want to leave." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "I don't understand. My technique was rusty. I made mistakes. That passage in the third movement wasn't clean at all." The young man smiled. "I don't think anyone cared about that. Whatever you did out there, it meant something to people." Margaret sat down on a folding chair, suddenly exhausted. She closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. When she opened them, a well-dressed man in his 50s was standing in front of her. He had a press badge clipped to his jacket. "Ms. Chen, I'm Robert Chen with the New York Times. No relation, I assume?" he added with a slight smile. "I've been reviewing classical music performances for over 2 decades, and I've never witnessed anything quite like what happened tonight. Would you be willing to answer a few questions?" Margaret's eyes widened. "The New York Times wanted to interview her?" "I suppose so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert pulled up another folding chair and sat across from her. He had his notepad out, but he wasn't writing yet. He was just looking at her with genuine curiosity. "How long have you been playing violin?" "I started when I was 6, Margaret said. "But I stopped when I was 12. I only picked it up again about 6 months ago." Robert's eyebrows shot up. 6 months? You haven't been playing for 50 years?
"No, I put it away for a long time."
Life got in the way. Margaret found herself telling him the story. About Juilliard. About her father's stroke. About raising her siblings and working multiple jobs and watching 40 years slip by, while her violin gathered dust in a closet. Robert was writing now, his pen moving quickly across the page. But he kept stopping to look up at her, and she could see something in his eyes. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. "Why did you decide to start playing again?" he asked. Margaret thought about that for a moment. "My youngest sister, Rita, she got married last year. Beautiful wedding. I was so happy for her. But on the drive home, I realized something. All my siblings had grown up. They had their own lives now. My parents passed away years ago, and I was sitting in my car alone, wondering what I had left. What was mine? She paused, remembering that moment. The empty feeling. The sense that she'd somehow lost herself along the way. I went home and opened the closet where I'd stored my violin. I hadn't looked at it in decades. I was almost afraid to. But when I took it out and held it, something shifted inside me. I realized it wasn't too late. Maybe I'd never be a professional musician. Maybe I'd miss that chance. But I could still play. I could still have this. Robert was nodding as he wrote. And the community competition? How did that come about? A friend saw a flyer at the library. It was open to anyone. No professional experience required. She kept bugging me to enter. I kept saying no. But she wouldn't give up. Finally, I thought, why not? What's the worst that could happen? And you won. I couldn't believe it. The prize was this performance tonight. When they told me, I almost backed out. I didn't think I belonged here. I'm not a real musician. I'm just an old woman who plays violin in her living room. You're wrong about that, Robert said gently. After tonight, no one will ever question whether you're a real musician. Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes again. She'd cried more today than she had in years. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Robert asked about her choice of music, about what she was feeling on stage, about her plans for the future. Margaret answered as honestly as she could, though part of her still felt like this was all some kind of dream she'd wake up from. When Robert finally left, thanking her profusely, Margaret gathered her things and prepared to go home. But as she walked toward the exit, she saw a small figure waiting by the door. A girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, clutching a violin case that looked almost too big for her. The girl had been waiting there the whole time, her mother standing patiently beside her. When she saw Margaret approaching, the girl's eyes went wide. She looked nervous but determined. "Ms. Chen?" the girl said, her voice soft and uncertain. "Yes, sweetheart? I'm Amy. I play violin too. Or I used to. We can't afford lessons anymore, and my mom says we might have to sell my violin to help pay bills. But then we got free tickets to tonight's concert, and I heard you play, and I just..." The girl's voice cracked. "I don't want to give up, but I don't know if I'm good enough to keep going without lessons." Margaret's heart clenched. She knelt down so she was eye level with the girl, her knees protesting at the movement. She looked into Amy's eyes and saw herself at that age. That same desperate love for music. That same fear of losing it. "Can I tell you something?" Margaret said. "When I was about your age, maybe a little older, I got accepted to one of the best music schools in the country. Full scholarship. It was my dream, but I had to give it up to help my family. And for a long time, I thought that meant my dream was over, dead and buried." Amy was listening intently, her eyes locked on Margaret's face. "But tonight I learned something important. Dreams don't die. They just wait. Sometimes for a very long time. But they wait." Margaret reached out and gently touched the girl's violin case.
Keep playing.
"Even if you can't afford lessons. Even if you have to practice in your room with the door closed. Even if it's just 15 minutes a day. Keep playing. Because that music inside you, it's yours. No one can take it away unless you let them." "But what if I'm not good enough?" Amy whispered. Margaret smiled. "Did you hear those people clapping tonight? I made mistakes out there. My technique isn't perfect. I'm nowhere near as good as I could have been if I'd gone to Juilliard all those years ago. But you know what? It didn't matter. Because I wasn't playing to be perfect. I was playing to share something true. And that's what people responded to." She stood up, her knees creaking, and looked at Amy's mother. The woman had tears in her eyes. "How much are violin lessons around here?" Margaret asked. "About $60 a week," the mother said. "We just can't manage it right now. My husband was laid off 3 months ago and we're barely keeping up with rent." Margaret reached into her purse. She'd brought $300 with her tonight. Money she'd saved from her part-time job at the library. It was supposed to be for emergencies. She pulled out the entire amount and held it out to Amy's mother. "This should cover a few weeks at least," Margaret said. The mother's eyes went wide. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly..." "Please," Margaret said firmly. "Someone helped me when I was young. A teacher who paid for gas to drive me to competitions. Who believed in me when no one else did. Let me do this. Let me be that person for Amy." The mother took the money with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face now. Thank you. You have no idea what this means, but Margaret did know. She knew exactly what it meant. It meant Amy would get to keep her dream alive a little bit longer. Maybe that would make all the difference. 3 weeks later, Margaret received a package in the mail. Inside was a copy of the New York Times from the Sunday after her performance. Robert's review was on the front page of the arts section. The headline read, "A lesson in what music really means." The review talked about technical aspects only briefly. Instead, Robert wrote about truth and sacrifice and the difference between perfection and authenticity. He wrote about how Margaret's performance had reminded him why he fell in love with music in the first place. He wrote about seeing hardened critics crying openly. He wrote about an audience that didn't want to leave. The last paragraph stuck with Margaret. In a world obsessed with technical perfection and virtuoso displays, Margaret Chen reminded us that music's true power lies not in flawless execution, but in honest expression. She proved that it's never too late to reclaim a dream. And in doing so, she gave hundreds of people permission to reclaim their own. Margaret cut out the review and put it on her refrigerator. Right above it, she taped something else. A photo that Amy's mother had sent. It showed Amy at her first lesson in months, violin in hand, with the biggest smile Margaret had ever seen. Margaret looked at that photo every morning while she made her coffee. And every morning she thought the same thing. Maybe giving up Juilliard all those years ago had been a tragedy. Or maybe it had been necessary to become the person who could stand on that stage and play something that truly mattered. She'd never know for sure. But standing in her kitchen, looking at Amy's smiling face, she thought maybe it was okay not to know. Maybe some questions didn't need answers. That evening, Margaret picked up her violin and began to practice. She had been invited to perform at 3 more venues. Small ones, nothing as grand as Carnegie Hall. But that was fine with her. She wasn't doing this for fame or recognition anymore. She was doing it because at 63 years old, she'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. It's never too late. Dreams don't have expiration dates. They just wait, patient and persistent until you're finally ready to claim them. And when you do claim them, even if it's decades later than you planned, even if you're not as good as you might have been, even if your hands shake and your technique is rusty, it's still worth it. It's always worth it. Margaret drew her bow across the strings and began to play.